From the Chesapeake Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental reporting, this is Chesapeake Uncharted, the podcast that uncovers stories about the bay, its interconnected ecosystem, and the people who rely on them. I'm Jeremy Cox. On today's episode,
people who were not exposed to the actual disaster itself should be reminded about how disastrous it was and realize that it can happen again. You could build a levee system on both sides of the Susquehanna River for its entire length, and Mother Nature could put its waters 1 inch above that.
A lesson learned the hard way. This is David DeCosmo. When Tropical Storm Agnes ripped through central Pennsylvania in June 1972, DeCosmo was the news director of a radio station in Wilkes-Barre. But as the floodwaters rose and the situation grew more dire, he would find himself thrust into a new role. There were no local emergency management agencies as we know them today. What they had was civil defense. You know, the people behind those now hilarious duck and cover drills in schools back in the 1950s. Needless to say, natural disasters were not their main focus, but that's exactly what was unfolding now. And DeCosmo knew that his best chance to stay on top of the news in the coming days was to head downtown to the county's civil defense office.
It occurred to me that it might be better to go to the courthouse and call back reports. Now, ironically, when I showed up, it turned out civil defense had everything it needed but one thing. It had no public information officer. I was literally drafted. I mean that quite literally, as the public information officer for civil defense.
DeCosmo was now in the center of the storm, in more ways than one. Agnes was pounding the region with rainfall. The Susquehanna River was rising quickly, and the city's primary form of defense, its 37-foot-tall levee, was in danger of being overtopped. In the early morning hours of June 23, 1972, things were looking grim. Every available hand was at work feverishly shoring up the flood wall with thousands of sandbags. Suddenly, a newsflash came from 60 miles upstream at Towanda that another kind of wall, a wall of water, was barreling their way.
Well, the reading from upstream, the reading from Towanda, was just one that told us, when I say us, I mean civil defense, that there was no chance of holding the river back. It was going to top whatever we could do in the amount of time we had. And at that time, the decision was made that very shortly we would abandon the sandbagging and sound the evacuation siren.
DeCosmo ventured outside long enough to watch in horror as a major bridge crumbled under pressure from the raging waters. Finally, the evacuations were ordered. Sirens started blaring around the city. As you can hear in these excerpts from his broadcast, DeCosmo summoned as much composure as he could muster to deliver the message.
Get out now. Get out now. There's still time, but this is the warning that the river is starting to come over the dike.
Work on the dikes has ceased. The water is expected to break through. Keep your head about you. There are plenty of people around to help you out. You have places to stay. You will have food. You will have bedding. You will have everything. So don't panic. Just get yourself to safety.
At 11 a.m., the forecast became a reality. The Susquehanna River came surging over the levee and into the streets of Wilkes-Barre. During this season of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're taking stock of Agnes. This year marks the storm's 50th anniversary, but in many ways, the effects of Agnes are still with us. With each episode, I'm exploring how we're still living in the world Agnes created. People still live with the emotional scars. Communities from Virginia up to New York still bear physical scars. And the Chesapeake Bay still bears environmental scars. We'll talk about why this still matters today and for our future. Today, we're looking at Agnes through the lens of Wilkes-Barre, a city that seemed like it had little to fear from a storm like Agnes. After all, it was protected by a formidable flood barrier. People put faith in their wall, DeCosmo recalls, and in many cases, That belief kept them from realizing they were in danger until it was too late.
This area had only been hit with a flood of major proportions once before. That was in the 1930s. The levee system had been raised since then. And so you had a generation of people who lived through that flood who now believe they were totally protected, and a generation or two of people beyond that age group. They had no knowledge of it, no memory of it.
In this episode, I'd like to have a conversation about what flood protection means, what it meant in Agnes's day, and what it means today. Here on the east coast of the United States, two major impacts of climate change, rising sea level and heavier rains, lend an urgent backdrop to this question. There is a limit to the resources we can deploy to armor our coast from sea level rise and protect inland areas from excessive rainfall. Not every community can be saved. So, who and what should we protect? That question leads to one that's even more fundamental. Can we be sure that those protections will work? The story of Pennsylvania's confrontation with Tropical Storm Agnes 50 years ago, I think offers some insights. We'll talk about that after a break. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you in part by Greenfin Studio, a marketing and communication firm focused on coastal, environmental, and social projects. They have helped hundreds of organizations engage new audiences and reach environmental goals. If your organization wants fresh ideas to expand your reach and deliver more effective messages, check them out at greenfinstudio.com. Welcome back. On today's episode of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're talking about flood walls, how they performed against Tropical Storm Agnes in 1972, and what that can tell us about the modern fight against climate change. I'm in a windowless room inside a gray, single-story building just a few doors down from a prison in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. There's a conference table in the middle. The room is otherwise filled with computers, communication equipment, and shelves lined with spiral-bound reports. This is the home of the Luzerne County Emergency Management Agency, and this is the room where disaster planning starts.
You are currently in the situation room. This is a smaller version of emergency operations room. In it, we also have a nuclear power plant in Luzerne County, so over in the corner there is a siren system. Should something happen within a 10-mile radius of the power plant.
But during a storm, this would be a gathering place?
We always start in this room. This is like 7 days out, 8 days out. The National Weather Service calls. We put their briefing on the big board here, the smart board here.
David Elmore is the agency's second in command, and seated next to him is Charlie Cromes, an emergency planner. Aside from nuclear mishaps, what worries them the most is the prospect of another Agnes-like storm. What kind of storm gives you the most heartburn?
Anything that is the projected level of crest is anything over 25, 26 feet. Yeah. So when you reach that level, you have a good 35 to 50% of the municipalities being affected with water. And then it gets up to 32. Now you're talking almost 100%. Somewhere, everyone's being affected.
At 32 feet, every community along the Luzerne County section of the Susquehanna is affected by some amount of flooding. During Agnes, the river rose well above that. Cromes pulled a report down from one of the shelves behind him to confirm the right number. What you got there, Charlie?
I got Saturday, June 24th at 7 p.m., 1972, 40.6 feet.
40.6, there you go.
40.6.
At that level, every community is going to see some flooding somewhere, but not everyone will be affected equally. Some places along the Susquehanna are protected by formidable and expensive flood barriers. Throughout the Wyoming Valley, the stretch of the river that includes the Wilkes-Barre area, you will find 16 miles of shoreline walled off by a levee. usually in the form of an earthen berm topped by a shorter steel or concrete wall. I started to ask Elmore and Crome specifics about the levee system, but they politely begged off. It's not their expertise. As it happened, a walking encyclopedia of Wyoming Valley flood protection was just about to enter the room.
And assist. One of the finest men I've known just walked in the door. How you doing, Jim?
Good, how you been?
Good, sir. I'm doing well. Very well.
Jim Brazina started working for the county in 1979 as an assistant engineer. He was the head engineer for many years until moving over in 2006 to oversee the Luzerne County Flood Protection Authority. That's an independent agency that manages the flood control system. He retired in 2013, but still works as a consultant. Brazina had arrived a little early for our scheduled interview. He came to give me a narrated tour of Wilkes-Barre's battles with flooding, past and present. Brazina got behind the wheel, and we were off. So we're going for a little tour here. I wanted to know how the wall came to be built in the first place.
This was purely as a result of a flood in 1936 in Wilkes-Barre.
He told me that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers swept in after the devastating flood and, over the next 2 decades, constructed flood barriers up and down this section of the river. Agnes was its first big test, and as you already know, it failed. Brazina pulled up to a picturesque spot where the wall is a centerpiece of a downtown waterfront park and amphitheater. It's got some of that fresh air.
Yeah.
He immediately launched into how this formerly drab space was transformed into a community asset.
This is called the Millennium Circle.
Okay.
It's, this big expanse. It has a fountain that unfortunately is not operating at this point. There is a community foundation called the Luzerne Foundation that did a fundraiser in 2000 where they were trying to get...
There was a wall here during Agnes, but not this one. After 1972, the Army Corps and the local flood authority spent years designing and building a $200 million overhaul of the valley's flood protection system. That included raising the walls up and down the valley by an average of 3 to 5 feet. The project spanned the entirety of Brazina's career. The final pieces didn't come together until 2009. We walked under a metal footbridge through a wide gap in the barrier, a gate that can be closed during floods. Here, Brazina pointed to a black line on the riverside of the wall. It was at least an arm's length above his head.
This line right here is how high the water was in 1972.
At least on this day, the Susquehanna below us looked harmless. It was a good ways below where we were standing. As I stood there, I had a hard time imagining it could ever rise up this high. But of course, it has. The Susquehanna, bloated by Agnes's rain, easily overtopped the lower wall that was in place in 1972. Ultimately, 60% of the city would become flooded, and 100,000 people would have to evacuate. Brazina and I hopped back in his car. We were off again, this time to see just how far the floodwaters traveled in Agnes's day. Normally, he told me, the river is about 700 feet wide. During Agnes, the Susquehanna spread out over an area 2 miles wide, drowning everything in its path. We passed single-story houses that had been flooded up to their roof lines.
The water was 10 to 12 feet deep.
Wow. I mean, we're pretty far from the river already, several blocks. We kept going, Brazina driving, pointing out 50-year-old water levels.
This was a hospital that was impacted.
Finally, mercifully, the flood did run out of land to conquer. Over a half-mile from the river, Brazina gestured toward an old multi-story brick warehouse.
So, over there you see that's what's the old Stegmeyer Brewery with that cupola on it.
Okay.
That is where the water stopped. They were putting in boats and going back into town this way. So now we're sort of on the edge of town.
Today, you wouldn't know that this place was once the epicenter of the worst national disaster of its day. It's a pleasant downtown with a leafy public square and mid-rise office buildings. That was the silver lining with Agnes, Brzezina said. Relief funds came pouring in, and the city got a complete makeover. New sewers, new roads, new parks, new trees. Wilkes-Barre also got its higher flood wall. And would you believe it? Just 2 years after its 2009 completion, the wall faced down a flooding threat even bigger than Agnes. Remember that black mark on the flood wall? It wasn't the only one that Brzezina pointed out to me when we were down by the river.
And then the second black line that you see is how high the water was in 2011. This thing did its job and did it magnificent. If the levees hadn't been raised, we would have been in the same position that this community would have been in 1972.
That was Tropical Storm Lee. It didn't dump as much rainfall as Agnes did, but it caused the Susquehanna to rise higher than in Agnes. The reason? The higher floodwalls in the Wyoming Valley region kept the water from spilling into its surrounding floodplain, reserving more for the river's main stem.
It was less water than in Agnes, but now the flood at Wilkes-Barre is confined between higher walls.
This is Gary Letcher, the Agnes historian we met in the last episode.
So in Agnes, the flood came to 41 feet. In Lee, it came up to 43 feet. It was actually 2 feet higher because it wasn't spreading out.
I have another quick anecdote about the wall that I think is telling. During Agnes, Wilkes-Barre flooded despite the presence of the flood barrier. In doing so, experts believe that it spared some places farther downstream. Donald Duke remembers it well. He was a 15-year-old at the time. His family lived in Sunbury, where the Susquehanna and the West Branch collide, creating a single channel that eventually flows into the Chesapeake Bay. So you can think of a big bullseye hanging over the community when central Pennsylvania gets too much rainfall.
The atmosphere was very tense. We were waiting to see, would our town be washed away?
Sunbury had a wall, but over what felt like an eternity, the townspeople watched helplessly as the surface of the Susquehanna crept up higher and higher. It ended up reaching nearly the very top of the wall, but the wall held up. Sunbury was saved. Duke, now a flood policy expert at Florida Gulf Coast University, said Sunbury probably had Wilkes-Barre's woes to thank for its better fortunes.
The failure of the levees in Wilkes-Barre was recognized at the time as what saved Sunbury. It's not like that was the intent, not by any means, but the fact that one of the earthen levees in Wilkes-Barre gave way was credited with taking the top of the crest off.
This episode led to one of the most enduring images from Agnes, a spray-painted message on the Sunbury flood barrier proclaiming, "We love you, wall." On our way back to the emergency department's office, I asked Brzezina if he thought this new wall, this higher wall, could withstand the heavier rainfall patterns brought on by climate change. His response was basically, don't count on it.
When we looked at this project, the Agnes flood was predicted to be the 370-year flood. We don't use those terms anymore, but that's what it was called. And if you now look at what the Agnes level storm is, it's probably a 75-year flood. Mm-hmm. So as we see climate change, it's going to become more and more difficult, and there may be a day sometime down the road where they're going to have to look to, again, raise the levees even higher.
It's starting to sound like we're in a no-win situation here. We can keep building higher and bigger, but as long as the climate keeps changing, we just don't know whether these measures are going to keep us safe. What if there was another way? It turns out that has been the subject of Brzezina's second life. After Lee, the Federal Emergency Management Agency stepped up its program of buying homes in flood-prone areas across the Wyoming Valley for the purpose of tearing them down. After he retired from the Flood Authority, Brzezina took over as the regional head of the effort.
I've been working with the local municipalities and unprotected communities, and over that 10 years we've acquired and demolished over 300 properties to give the floodplain back to Mother Nature. So another untold story here is that, yes, we may have a flood even the same size as what happened in 2011, but in those communities the amount of damages will be much, much less because there's no homes there anymore.
The program is entirely voluntary. No one is forced to sell. But let's slow down here. Helping people get out of harm's way sounds like a noble cause. But what about the places that are left behind? More importantly, what about the people there? To see for myself the consequences of the buyouts, I got back in my car and drove about 30 minutes southwest of Wilkes-Barre to a small community at the bottom of a hill, directly adjacent to the Susquehanna River. Hey, all right, looks like we've made it to Susquehanna here, and we're following the western bank of the Susquehanna River. And to the far side is a very tall mountain ridge covered in trees, and on my side, there's a very tall mountain ridge covered in trees, so we're very much in a narrow valley here. I made a left turn into a long rectangle of a neighborhood, with 2 streets paralleling the river, and a couple of shorter roads connecting them. There's this large, flat green area with trees kind of interspersed where you would expect to see houses in between, except there's no houses. Not anymore, at least. The bulk of the town of Susquehanna was perched a little higher up the hill, but down by the river, it was almost a ghost town. A few houses here and there, but most of the lots were empty. You could see where there were cutouts in the curb where a driveway had been, but all that remained beyond that would be grass. Before 2011, this neighborhood had about 50 structures. Today, there are fewer than 10, according to the local newspaper, the Sunday Dispatch. In search of literally anyone to talk to, I walked back up the main road, Route 11, and ducked inside the Curry Donut Shop. I met the owner, Charlotte Shales. She bought the business a year ago. She serves up all the morning necessities: donuts, breakfast sandwiches, coffee, you name it. Like many communities in the area, Susquehanna was founded around the coal industry. And like many of its neighbors, the town's fortunes have faded, along with those of the industry. Its population has declined from a high of about 2,500 in the 1930s to about 600 today. Tropical Storm Lee certainly didn't help matters. After the storm and the ensuing buyouts, the town lost a quarter of its remaining population. The building that now houses Curry Donut flooded during Lee, Shales told me.
Yeah, I forget how high. It was up in here pretty far.
Because
I know the previous owner had to redo the inside and stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm not exactly sure how high it came up. But
that didn't discourage you from deciding to invest in your business here, though?
No, I'm crazy. Oh, if it floods, it floods. What are you going to do?
Right.
You know?
Do you have flood insurance?
I don't own the building. I just own the business. The gentleman that owns the building has flood insurance.
Okay, that's good. Shales, who grew up in another town nearby, started ticking off the businesses that have fled Susquehanna over the years. The local movie theater, the Ben Franklin 5 and Dime, the locally owned clothing store. Some closed because of economic conditions, and others, well, they simply got tired of getting flooded out and shut their doors for good. But Shales saw that several other businesses, mostly small mom-and-pop places, were sticking it out and thriving. So she decided to give her own business a try. Do you feel like you're trying to bring it back?
I would love to see Susquehanna turn around and be like it used to be and have more businesses come in.
Susquehanna and the 9 other communities in the Wyoming Valley where the buyouts took place after Lee, they all had something in common. We'll talk about that after this last break.
Hi, this is Laura Lutz, editor at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. I hope you're enjoying our podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join the community of Bay Journal readers. If you care about climate change, wildlife, clean air, healthy communities, and of course the Bay and its rivers, you'll find news you can use at the Bay Journal, along with some great ideas for outdoor travel. Our subscriptions are free. Check us out at bayjournal.com and click on subscribe to start receiving the best independent environmental news in the Bay region.
Hello again. On this episode of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're discussing a region called the Wyoming Valley. But don't worry, we're still well inside the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We're examining how central Pennsylvania grapples with frequent flooding from the Susquehanna River, one of the Bay's major rivers. The town of Susquehanna was one of about a dozen communities along the river that became the focus of a $15 million FEMA-led buyout program. Owners of flood-prone properties in these communities could accept a government check and head for higher ground. What these buyout communities have in common is that they're, let's say, economically less important. That's no accident. Brezina told me that to get the Army Corps to build you a wall, your community must have enough economic value to justify the expense.
Because what happens is that for federal participation, you have to meet benefit cost ratio. And you need a mass of infrastructure, and homes surprisingly don't really make that up. It's commercial and realistically industrial properties that push you over the edge.
Right.
But for these other communities, Susquehanna, they wanted a levee, but when you've got a community that's a mile long and 500 feet deep, you got to build a lot of levee to protect not a lot of people, and it just doesn't work, unfortunately.
After repeated flooding, central Pennsylvania communities have split into two camps, the haves and the have-nots. The haves, like Wilkes-Barre, are able to access flood protection funding because of their economic importance. Meanwhile, the have-nots, like Susquehanna, having no such access, are forced to hasten their own demise. Why does this matter to us now? History has a funny way of repeating itself. Right now, climate change is compelling many towns and cities across the Chesapeake Bay watershed to prepare for a wetter future. Whether it's sea level rise or rivers overflowing their banks more often, the risks are growing. And so too are the costs to protect homes and businesses. Who will get to stay, and who will have to retreat? There will be exceptions, of course, but my bet is that what's past will be prologue. The Wilkes-Barre-type places will be heavily armored, and the Susquehanna-type places will have to either live with the water or get out of the way. Jim Brezina has seen this dilemma from just about every angle, from massive public works solutions to negotiating sales of flood-afflicted properties. I have another bet. Whatever is going to be the next big thing in the world of flood fighting, Brezina will be in the center of it. So what's the future hold for you, do you think? You said you've been involved in hundreds, it sounds like, with buyouts. Is this just going to keep going? Or
No, I'm trying to sunset my career here a little bit. I've been doing this for 40 years, so it's been interesting. You know, I have been extremely fortunate in my career in that I got to deal with this, $250 million construction project. It took a long time to do it, but not many engineers in their career get to work on one project their whole career. And the last 10 years, it was something that I started before I retired. There was a void, and I just stepped into, and I thought, this isn't going to take long. Well, here I am 10 years later, and I'm still at it, so.
Greenfin Studio combines creative design, strategic marketing, and scientific expertise to deliver for our clients. Visit greenfinstudio.com to view their portfolio and ask them how they can help you. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you by the Bay Journal. your source for independent environmental news in the Chesapeake region. Production for this episode was by me, Jeremy Cox. The story was edited by Laura Lutz. Our marketing and advertising director is Jackie Kane. You can find more episodes of Chesapeake Uncharted on your favorite streaming service or at ChesapeakeUncharted.com. If you like what you're hearing, sign up for a free Bay Journal news subscription at BayJournal.com. Until next time, this has been Jeremy Cox. Take care.